Montgomery with Imagine Products, and today I want to talk to you about media management or data wrangling. Imagine Products is a 25-year-old company. We've been around for a while, and we make Mac and Windows applications for workflow processes. We're better known these days probably for our offloading application called ShotPut Pro, our archiving one for pre-roll post that controls LTO decks and Sony ODA, things like that. We also make viewing and transcoding applications. So we've been doing these sort of things for a few years. What I want to talk about media management is specifically related to limited resource productions. So we're not talking about the big guys. We're talking about, you may have one person dedicated to this or none. That's something that you have to do in the background. Basically, why is media management important? Well, in today's world, digital media means you have some very large files to move around or many files. It's important to be able to do that correctly and without errors, and to make sure that the copies exactly match the originals and that you're not losing anything. We'll also talk a little bit about how do you preserve it and store it for long term, those sorts of things. And I'll touch on recovery. That's probably something most people don't plan on, but if something goes wrong, you want to know what to do and what's the best thing to do, or tools to have in your possession just in case. So some of the general concepts may sound very obvious. Use the fastest setup available to you. You don't always have the choice what kind of equipment to use, but sometimes you do. And so you want to make sure that you match your computer's capabilities with the media that you're going to be working with and that you're going to be outputting it to. Obviously, you want to test the equipment. You want to do that, plug everything in, make sure you have the latest drivers, make sure you have plenty of empty space on your computer, that the hard disks that you're copying to have recently been formatted, and things like that. I swear, some of our people that use our software often are downloading it on their way to the airport to go to someplace exotic. And that's a testament to the fact that the products or our products are easy to use or learn. But, it's better if you can know ahead of time that everything's going to work well and that you're ready to go. Most importantly, you want to be organized. Yeah, that sounds pretty obvious too, but I want to touch a little bit on, some of the things that you should do and be more professional about in your offloading situations. So some of the bottlenecks when you're trying to set up a system, first of all, you want to look at your card's capability, the things that you're going to be offloading. How fast are they? Most media cards like S by S cards or P2 cards or CFast cards, any of those kind of cards generally can copy, or you can read them about twice as fast as they can record. So a CFast card, for example, will record at about 240 megs per second, but you can pull off of that at over 500. But then you got to kind of match that to your hardware. So if your reader is connected to the computer by a slow connection, then having a fast media isn't going to do you much good. You're going to be limited by the cable connecting to the computer. For example, FireWire 800 runs at about 100 meg per second, which is a pretty good match for most spinning media like 7200 RPM. External hard drives run at about 100, 120 meg per second is all you can expect from them. But faster connections like a USB 3, can be like 6 times that. So again, you want to try to match the capabilities of the reader and the connection to the computer to the media that you're trying to do. Your hard disk speed, again, 7200 RPM is very common. A G-Tech drive, many of the drives that people use these days are in that range, unless it's an SSD. An SSD is a digital media card or hard disk, and they can run up in the 500 meg range. So if you have that luxury and that budget, go for the SSDs because you're going to speed up everything all the way down the line. And a lot of people ask me, gosh, what kind of computer should I have? And how fast should the CPU be? And how much RAM do I need? And those sorts of things. But the truth is, usually, most modern computers, if it can run the latest operating system, the CPU and the RAM aren't going to make a lot of difference. It's really the bottlenecks are going to be something to do with your connection, your cables, the readers, those sorts of things. The only thing I would tell you in that regard is that RAM and CPU, for that matter, can make some difference in the verification process if you're using checksum technology, because that's a processing thing that happens rather than an I/O thing. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Here's a little chart that shows you some comparison between the various types of connections. And it's a little covered up at the bottom left there, but what it's talking about is the FireWire connections, and they're down the 100 meg range. A gigabit Ethernet connections about 100. And then the next step up is the SAS. And why did I throw that in there? Well, most SAS 3 gigabit connections, that's what most LTO drives use these days. Even the LTO7 drives, they actually have a SAS internal connection on them. So you're going to be limited on them to about 375 in that range. Notice that USB is much faster. The new USB 3.1 coming, and you're starting to see those on Windows computers, 1 or 2 Macs now, but that's coming down the line, is double the speed of the old USB 3s. And even they're up in the range of the Thunderbolt and the Thunderbolt 2. So, one thing to notice of this is even if I have a Thunderbolt connected hard disk, let's say, it really isn't going to help the speed too much. It's more of a connectivity convenience, if you will. Having, for example, a Thunderbolt connection to your LTO drive, there's several of those. That makes it real easy to plug into your Mac, but it's still going to run down into 370, 300. LTO7 is now about 300 meg per second range. So having the really fast connection isn't really going to help. It's just not going to be the bottleneck. Same thing with devices. I wanted to show you a little bit of comparison. Typical hard disks down on the lower side. Some of the typical media cards that people are using these days. The SBS Pro cards are around 150 in that range. CFast now is up to 240. I mentioned that before. Notice that the LTO6 and LTO7 is almost double the speed of LTO6, and it's faster than your CFast card, and it's much faster than hard disks. So unless you have an SSD, LTO7 can hum along pretty quickly. So this little, if your desk looks like this, you shouldn't be doing data wrangling. Just kidding. But you need to be organized. And here's some simple ideas. When you're on set, you want to make sure that you have a simple marking method for your cards. As they're coming out of the camera, and there's a lot of them coming at you, it's real easy to forget which one had something recorded on it, which one doesn't, was ready to go back to the camera, those sorts of things. So if you use, like some low adhesive tapes, you can tape the card. Say green is good, red is stop, don't use this card. If it doesn't have any tape on it, then, or you flip the little lock lever, that's a good process to have. Is if your card has a physical switch on it, when you take it out of the camera, turn it off, and that way, or lock it. That way, people know that there's something on that card yet. It hasn't been erased, and it needs to be offloaded. Lastly, you need some way of keeping notes. So you need some way of knowing what card's been offloaded, how many times has it been offloaded. It's a good idea to know generally what projects or what dates, those sorts of things, have been used per card in case you later find that you have a bad file or corrupt files or something along those lines. You want to know what other offloads were done with that card. And it's also a good idea to know how many times you've exercised that card or used it. As far as the next slide here is talking about in and out areas. Yeah, I don't expect you to use a little basket, but a lot of people would do like, anti-static bags or plastic tubs or something. Be very professional about this. Mark them. Say, this is the in, this is the out. You want to give verbal, consistent confirmation. When somebody hands you a card, you want to say something the same time. Always say, it's okay to format. Don't say something, that can be interpreted differently, like this is okay. Because people may think that that's you know, that's not really a very descriptive of what's going on. And like I said, you want to be consistent. So if you're going to do this in a professional manner, you always want to use the UPS battery backup, especially if you're going someplace where you're not familiar with the line power and how consistent or conditioned it is. This will help save a lot of your equipment. It'll keep you from having a lot of heartburn. You always want to use line power for everything. And by that, I mean you want to plug in your computer, not running off of batteries. You want to plug in your hard disks. You want to plug in your card reader. Anything that has a power adapter, plug it in, because offloading can take many hours and things can overheat. And if you're pulling a lot of power out of a USB port, you don't want that to be also where it's doing your data transfer. You want to try and keep the things cool and running and most efficient. Here's a little tip. You always want to go into your computer system setting and set it for never sleep. Yeah, professional offloading software like ours will attempt to keep the computer awake, but you never know. Have that little extra safeguard of setting that yourself just to make sure that something doesn't go into hibernation mode or turn off after you've offloaded for several hours. You wouldn't want to lose a big backup and have to start all over again just because of something silly like that. On this tip, I've seen a lot of people, you get bored. I know you're sitting there waiting for this offload to happen, listening to music or surfing the web or running some other app in the background. That's a very bad idea. Offloading is a critical step. You want to make sure that there's nothing that's going to interfere with your data or the speed it's going to take to offload the thing. Turn off all the apps on your computer. Turn off your virus protection because that's just going to slow things down. It's going to be looking at the files that are copied to make sure that it doesn't have virus in it. And you're coming off a camera, so it's not going to have viruses. So you want to turn those kind of things off and think about things like automatic updates and those sorts of things. Make sure those are all off. The other thing is that people don't realize that Spotlight is an app that runs in the background and it's looking at files as you're copying them. So you don't want to be browsing the copies on either side, on the source or the copy side, because it's going to, Spotlight will write little index files into those hard disk or media to index the material. And so that's adding to the time it takes as well as taking up some space. And it's just not a good idea. So if you can, turn off Spotlight altogether. It's not necessary, and never use Finder while you're copying to go look and browse at things. Leave it off. Don't look at it. A simple copy concept, sure, make at least 2 copies at the same time or in sequence. Don't erase the only copy you have until you've made at least 2 copies. So if one of those fails, then you definitely have an extra backup. If you need to deliver 2 copies, then you should be making 3 copies so you have another one in your possession. And you don't want to ship those, by the way, if you're delivering them. You don't want to put them both in the same FedEx box, have 2 separate shipments. Always use external drives. This sounds kind of simplistic as well, but I've seen people that use like their internal hard disk on their laptop. Well, most of those run much slower. They're running 5,400 RPM, a lot less throughput. It's going to be slower. You're just going to have to copy it off of those again anyway to get it to wherever you're going to. So better idea is to go directly to a hard disk. And we already touched on this. You're not going to erase that media until all your copies are made. And this sounds pretty obvious too, is you always want to copy everything that's on the card. Back when digital media was just starting out, a lot of people were like, well, I just need the video file. So they just copy that folder off of the card, or they wouldn't, I don't need the audio that the camera, stored. I'm doing that separately, things like that. Not realizing that there's a lot of metadata in other places often. And a lot of the editors are designed to look for an entire folder structure as it should be coming from specific camera formats. So you never want to delete anything or change any names of folders. Don't change anything. Copy everything on the card except hidden files. Don't need the hidden files. Again, don't just transcode these and save just those. A lot of people I know have had workflows in the past where they import it directly into the editor and say, well, I've got that, so I don't need the Canva originals. But the truth is that if you need to transfer at some point to another editing system, you don't have the originals anymore. You've got a transcoded copy, and if something goes wrong, then you're kind of screwed. Back around the time of QuickTime 7, when that was new, there was a problem where people were transcoding files on PowerPC Macs and discovered that those files wouldn't play on the new Intel Macs in the QuickTime because there was two different QuickTime teams at Apple and they didn't talk to each other and the files were not consistent. So a lot of people got a big surprise that, gosh, saving a transcoded file wasn't a really good idea. Why do I know that? Well, Imagine actually made a transferring app to salvage those files for a lot of people because Apple wasn't doing it. So again, just copy what's on the card. That's your best bet down the line that people will be able to actually access and import the data when they need it. Let's talk about verification. If you're just doing things like drag and drop in Finder or Windows Explorer, and you are comparing total file sizes, great idea, sort of. The problem with that is that in Finder, for example, Finder is only going to report to you the allocated space of the copy. So it's going to tell you back that, oh, yeah, they're always the same because it allocated the same amount of space that it needed to copy the files to. So unless something really catastrophic happens, Finder isn't really going to tell you that the two files match. Sure, total file sizes may give you some indication, but it's not really a good verification process. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is that Spotlight works with hidden files. It has a little index file that is going to have some size to it. And when you copy, you're not copying that hidden file. It has to create it again. So your total file count, how many files are in one place or the other, may be different because you're not copying the hidden file, or the sizes of the hidden file may be different. So in the grand scheme of things, we always tell people, don't copy the hidden files. There's really no reason to do that. And in fact, if your card or media hasn't been reformatted entirely, if it's just been erased and not reformatted in the camera or whatever, then you're copying a lot of hidden files that are just marked for deletion, but you're unnecessarily copying files that are no value to you. We always use checksums, and what that means is checksums is a type of algorithm that looks at a file's contents and its byte count and byte position and comes up with a numeric binary number that describes that file, that size and content of that file. It is mathematically very high probability that if two files have the same checksum that they're identical. It's astronomical. It's more than winning the lottery. So it's a very good way to determine that the files are indeed exactly the same, regardless of how they're named or what Finder tells you, those sorts of things. By the way, back on the Finder discussion a little bit, if you're comparing media files, for example, any card reader has to install a driver, and you're looking at the contents of the card through that driver that talks to Finder. So it's very important that you have the latest version of the driver that matches your operating system. But again, that's why you're not, it's not a really good comparison because it's a virtual representation. It's not the same as a hard disk. And so you always want to make sure that you have the correct and most up-to-date drivers and those sorts of things. So checksum types, there's many different kinds. I think we have half a dozen in our apps, and I'm sure there's many others out there. And a lot of them have different uses. Over the years, they've come out for things for like communication protocols and those sorts of things. The most common in our industry is either MD5 or the newer XX hash. These two are, we've kind of standardized on those because of their speed and flexibility. MD5 is more CPU intensive type checksum process, whereas XX hash actually uses your computer's RAM. So if you have a computer with faster RAM, like the new Mac Pro desktops, you're going to get a little faster throughput with XX hash. And also, XX hash is more forgiving or useful for situations where you have lots of files, like raw files, where there's tens of thousands of files instead of just a few big ones. Lastly, it's a good idea to play the clips. Have some kind of player where you can go in and sample the clips and look at the beginning, the middle, the end, just to kind of look at it and make sure that the files weren't corrupt coming in, because if you just copied a corrupt file, then they may exactly match, but it's still corrupt. Or, a little quality control, make sure there isn't an audio boom coming into your scene or something like that. But playing the clips is not a good way of telling that you have good files necessarily, or that it's matching the originals. It's simply another layer of making sure that you're getting something good coming out of your camera. We offer an application called HD View that plays clips. It plays over 20 different formats in the original camera form without transcoding or any kind of destruction. Telestream, I think, makes another one of those. There's a couple different players out there, and there's always players by the camera manufacturers for a specific type as well. So, what can go wrong? Gosh, nothing could ever go wrong, right? Well, a very common thing is you've delivered your hard disk to your client, and they come back and say, gosh, there's clips missing. Here's where you need some kind of log or report that tells you or shows them, yes, I did copy them. Here's all the files it shows that they were on this hard disk, where they were named. Sometimes it may be as simple as they're in a different folder than the client expected. Could be something more serious, like the hard disk is beginning to fail. I've seen that before, where every time they plugged the hard disk in, there was fewer and fewer files showing up in Finder. So dipping into that a little bit, most people know that your hard disk, the way that a computer looks at it, is through an index called FAT table. It's an index to where the files are allocated, file allocation table. And the most common thing that happens is if that gets corrupted somehow, then the computer loses track of where the files are on the hard disk. Usually the data is not damaged, it's just the FAT table's messed up and you can't figure out where they are. And those kind of things are repairable as well. Other things that can go wrong is intermittent copies. Well, gosh, what could that mean? A lot of times people don't realize, but card readers can get very hot, especially CF card readers, some of those. You want to make sure that you have a reader that's designed for professionals, not something that's just consumer grade. Those kind of things, typically you're pulling files off of there very quickly and for a sustained period of time, so the thing can get very warm. So it's a good idea, if you have a card reader, for example, to have more than one in your bag and alternate between them to give it a chance to cool off. Same thing with cables. Many people don't realize, but cables can corrode. When you purchase a cable, it comes, whether it's FireWire or Thunderbolt, USB, any of those will come with a little plastic cap on the end. And the reason for that is to protect it from starting to corrode. And after you pull that off and you're using it, it's exposed to the atmosphere and so forth. If it's rattling around in your kit, in your bag, you can get lint in there, those sorts of things. And the other question I guess I have for you is, how old are your cables? It's a good idea to label your cables when you purchased it, so you know how long it's been in service. A lot of times, cables are not designed for repeated insertions and pulling out. They're usually designed for consumer type You plug it in your computer and you plug in the accessory a few times and that's it, not in and out, in and out, in and out. So they can wear out. They can become intermittent and giving you problems with the copies. Another thing that can happen is if you have a digital recorder, some of those, they basically run a virtual file system as well. So you want to make sure with a digital recorder that you plug it in and you wait a minute or two before you start copying anything off of it. Even if it shows up on your desktop, you want to make sure that the driver has had a chance to index all the material that's on that disk before you institute a copy, so that you don't miss some of the clips. With file sizes, we've mentioned that before. A lot of times that's got to do with the drivers or the number of cards or hidden files that are on the card, versus you didn't copy those to the new location. And we can spend a whole lot of time on slow copies. But again, I want to hit on hidden files is a bad idea. You don't want to copy the hidden files because that's just taking a lot of time for something that isn't going to do you any benefit. A lot of people don't realize, but the ports on your computer can become overwhelmed. A computer can usually process things a lot faster than the ports are designed to do. So if you try to push too much through a USB port, for example, it can become log jammed and actually slow things down much slower than what it would typically go at. So it's important that you have a copy utility that works with the computer to pace what the availability or what the ability of your computer port is, so that it doesn't go crazy and try to push too much through it. So here's some things that typically happens on the set, right? You've had a long day. Now you're back at the hotel or wherever, and you're copying cards, and you forget which card was which, and you accidentally erase what was on the card, and it was your only copy. Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. Well, most card manufacturers or camera manufacturers like Panasonic, Sony, all those guys, they actually have tools in place to recover what's on a card if it hasn't been overwritten. So the first thing you want to do is don't put anything else on the card. Don't try to recover the card with off the shelf software. You can get consumer software for repairing things or recovery. Don't do that. Contact the manufacturer. It'll cost you something for a fee, but they have the tools in place to recover those things. So again, the way that erasers work is that typically it doesn't actually reclaim the space. It just flags in the allocation table. These files no longer are needed, so they're flagged for removal, or you can reclaim that space by overwriting it. So what a lot of the recovery software is doing is it knows that, and it's just going through and assuming that you haven't overwritten it. It can look at the FAT table and restore things. Another thing that can happen, of course, is a true hard disk failure. Again, most failures are not. Most are just the allocation table is messed up for some reason. But if you have a mechanical or electrical failure, you can't handle those on your own. You need to take it to a professional service to reclaim or restore your data. If you made two copies, we wouldn't be having this discussion, so you wouldn't need to. But if it's your only copy and it's a critical data to get back, you need to go to a professional service. And those kind of recovery services like drivesavers.com, I know is a good one for our industry at least. They have to have a dictionary of the kind of files to expect on that drive. So an off-the-shelf consumer type application generally does not know what an MXF file is or an MTS file. So you need a product or a service that knows how to deal with those. They're going to want to know, like Drive Savers, if you use them, they're going to want to know what to expect on the drive. What kind of files are you looking for? What should be on there? So that, in a nutshell, is some of the basic data wrangling tips. And again, my name is Dan Montgomery with Imagine Products. Thanks.